Let's just jump right in, shall we? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a look under the hood of an absolute architectural marvel, the Indian Constitution. Now, the framers of this document didn't just slap together a patchwork of existing laws. No way. They engineered a completely bespoke, hybrid machine from the ground up, specifically designed to govern one of the most vast and diverse populations on the entire planet. It's really quite something.
To wrap our heads around this incredibly complex system, here is our roadmap. We'll start with borrowed but bespoke, then look at flexible yet rigid. After that, a true federation, followed by the unitary tilt, and finally, a federation of its own. Let's get to it.
Section 1. Borrowed but bespoke.
All right, we have to start by addressing the elephant in the room. The framers essentially globally sourced the best legal components they could find for their new nation. Now, sometimes people mistakenly view this as just mere copying, but as you're about to see, it was actually a highly intentional, strategic selection process to solve specific Indian challenges. They didn't start from an absolute blank slate. As you can see, the foundational bedrock was the Government of India Act of 1935. This historical document provided the core idea of federalism, the administrative structure for both the center and the states, and established crucial things like the office of the governor and the whole concept of a federal court.
This brilliantly illustrates what I like to call their smart sourcing strategy. The framers literally went shopping for the best democratic safeguards the world had to offer. They synthesized fundamental rights and an independent judiciary from the US to protect the individual. But for the actual day-to-day machinery of government, they turned to the UK, adopting the parliamentary system, the rule of law, and a single citizenship. Then they grabbed the directive principles of state policy from Ireland to guide social goals and adopted the really profound principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity from the French Constitution. It's like a giant puzzle perfectly fitted together.
And they didn't stop there. The engineering continued as they pulled from even more global blueprints to perfectly balance power. They integrated a federation with a really strong center from Canada, specifically ensuring residuary powers rested with the Union. From the Weimar Constitution in Germany, they took the concept of emergency powers, the suspension of fundamental rights during a crisis. Australia gave them the idea of a concurrent list and cooperative federalism. From Japan, they took the procedure established by law. And from South Africa, the actual mechanism used to amend the Constitution itself. They were engineering a truly custom framework, piece by piece.
Moving right along to Section 2, flexible yet rigid.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how this constitutional engine adapts. Because think about it. A constitution that cannot bend will eventually break, right? But one that bends way too easily offers absolutely no real foundation. To solve this dilemma, the designers built a dual mechanism system. They mixed everyday laws, which are flexible and super easy to change, with highly protected, rigid provisions. The flexible ones can be updated pretty effortlessly, requiring action only by the central legislature. But those rigid provisions, that's a different story. They demand a highly complex process. We're talking a constitutional amendment bill that has to be passed by the central legislature and then clear the massive hurdle of ratification by state legislatures.
So, while the Indian Constitution is largely flexible in its day-to-day operations, it strategically locks down certain fundamental mechanics. It's honestly an ingenious way to allow the nation to rapidly modernize its laws without risking the whole democratic foundation.
And here is the crucial point. Under Article 368, amending these rigid provisions requires a special majority in Parliament plus ratification by exactly 50% of the state legislatures. Half. This covers the big stuff, things like the election of the president, the extent of executive powers, the Supreme Court, high courts, and those three lists that divide power between the center and the states.
You might be wondering, why 50%? Well, this rigidity is absolutely not accidental. It acts as a permanent shield. The rigid nature of these specific provisions aims to protect the interests of the states from central overreach and to permanently maintain and protect the independence of the judiciary. Basically, the central government just cannot unilaterally change the rules of the game when it comes to state powers or the courts.
Which brings us to Section 3, a true federation?
With this incredibly careful balancing act between the center and the states, we've got to ask a really vital question. Does this intricate setup mean India actually operates as a true federation? Well, first, let's define our terms. A federal system, like you might find in the US, Canada, or Switzerland, is fundamentally defined by the decentralization of powers. It features dual governments, meaning a union or central government operating right alongside state or provincial governments, each with their own distinct spheres of authority. Now, if we look at the standard checklist for true federation, India ticks every single box perfectly. It's got a supreme, written constitution,
The center-state relations are totally protected by those rigid provisions we just talked about. Power is strictly divided into 3 lists in Schedule 7. It has a bicameral legislature at the center, with the Lok Sabha representing the popular will and the Rajya Sabha representing the states. And critically, it relies on a completely independent arbiter, the Supreme Court, to resolve disputes.
So on paper, it looks exactly like a textbook federation. But this brings us to a really fascinating twist built right into the Indian Constitution. What happens to this rigid, decentralized federal structure when the nation faces an existential crisis, like a war or a massive internal rebellion?
That leads us to Section 4, the unitary tilt.
Here is where we uncover the Constitution's hidden, almost shape-shifting ability. To really appreciate this shift, remember that a unitary system is the exact opposite of a federal one. It concentrates ultimate power entirely in the central government. Any power the local provinces have is merely delegated to them by the center and can totally be taken away. Think of systems in the UK, China, or France.
The sheer brilliance of this design is that during a national emergency, the federal division of powers is literally suspended. The entire system pivots. The Constitution suddenly operates as a completely unitary one. This allows the central government to act swiftly and decisively to protect the nation without getting bogged down in federal bureaucracy. It's a real game changer.
But here's what you really need to take away from this explainer. Even in normal peacetime, the central government holds massive, built-in advantages. For starters, there's only a single constitution and a single citizenship for the whole country. And, most shockingly to traditional federalists, under Article 3, the central parliament actually has the authority to alter the very borders, areas, and names of the states themselves. No way, right? Plus, the Union list of powers contains more subjects and arguably more important ones than the state list. If there's a clash on the concurrent list, the Union law prevails. Oh, and any completely new residuary power, that automatically goes to the Union, unlike in the US or Australia where it goes to the states.
On top of all that, there are 5 explicit conditions where the central parliament can legally bypass the state legislature and intervene directly on state subjects. This happens if the Rajya Sabha authorizes it under Article 249, during a national emergency under 250, if 2 or more states actively request it under 252, to implement an international treaty under 253, or during a state emergency under Article 356. Clearly, the center is undeniably the heavier counterweight in this whole system.
Finally, Section 5, a federation of its own. So, with all of these competing forces at play, a perfectly structured federal chassis, but an incredibly powerful unitary engine, how do we finally categorize this incredible constitutional machine? Well, unsurprisingly, there's been a massive historical debate over what to call it. While the original drafting committee confidently held that it was a federal system, leading constitutional experts looked at all those unitary tilts we just discussed and heavily disagreed. Professor K.C. Weir famously argued it was strictly quasi-federal, basically a unitary state with subsidiary federal features rather than a federal state with subsidiary unitary features.
But perhaps the most accurate, and honestly most elegant summary, comes from Professor Alexandrovitz. After analyzing this incredibly complex, shape-shifting system, he concluded that India is a case sui generis. It's completely in a class by itself. It isn't just a mere copy of the American or Canadian models, it is an entirely unique federation of its own type, engineered specifically for the Indian context. Hit the nail on the head, right? Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. How does this unique, shape-shifting architectural marvel, a system rigid enough to protect states, yet flexible enough to pivot to a unitary power during a crisis, continue to adapt? It's a true testament to the framers that an engine engineered over 7 decades ago still holds together one of the most diverse, dynamic nations on Earth today. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning how the systems around you are built.